I don't think I have to tell any of you that issues of global affairs are both vitally important today and incredibly pressing, but they're also matters on which people, politicians, pundits, and regular folks all around the world feel extraordinarily passionately about. Some of you may know, I think some of you do know, that college campuses have been criticized for presenting only one side of the debate about the state of the world, and that's the side that's critical of the United States and some of its principal allies. To my mind, that criticism is largely unfounded at the national level, and it's certainly not accurate with respect to UCLA. In the past year, we've sponsored several important events focusing on the Middle East. Last spring, we hosted the late Edward Said speaking about giving his perspective on the Arab-Israeli dispute. Just last week, we hosted Alan Dershowitz, who spoke about his new book, The Case for Israel. In the winter quarter, we're sponsoring again, I'm happy to report, a course for UCLA undergraduates called Global Hotspots, that has a visiting but rather distinguished professor leading the discussion. That professor is former Secretary of State Warren Christopher. During this October, which has been an extremely busy month for us, in addition to sponsoring Alan Dershowitz's visit, we also sponsored a debate on the future of U.S. foreign policy between Mel Levine and Bruce Hershenson, and a discussion about the new bottom-up peace proposal, Arab-Israeli peace proposal, by two of its principal supporters, former Israeli security chief Ami Ayalon and the Palestinian activist and academic Sari Nusseibeh. This proposal has not only attracted, I think it's now 150,000 signatures and counting. Paul Wolfowitz has also commented positively on it recently. Throughout all of this programming, our goal has been essentially the same: to present the widest range of views on the most important topics and to do it at the highest possible level. Today, you're all here to participate in an event that surely hits each of these three criteria directly on the head. For people in the contemporary United States, Al Jazeera is both well-known and a mystery. Does it offer hope for authentic, open, and very modern media in the new Middle East and the Muslim world? Or, as it's often portrayed, is it the voice of radical Islam and anti-Americanism? I suspect that many fewer of you are familiar with Radio Sawa, which was created by the US government in the wake of September 11 as a vehicle for communicating directly with citizens of Middle Eastern countries in their native tongue. It's designed to provide accurate and plentiful information not only about the US, but about all matters of interest to people living in the region. I certainly believe that insecurities and animosities born of ignorance and misinformation are a major impediment to global peace, prosperity, and freedom. In the modern world of instantaneous communication and limitless opportunities for dissemination of information, the role of the media in affecting the future direction of the world is surely greater than at any time previously in human history. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be a positive role. The media could, for example, reinforce inaccurate stereotypes and inflame visceral emotions that fuel unease and conflict. But alternatively, the media could help us to mitigate these problems by giving people timely and accurate information on which to make their own judgments of their own governments and the lives they want to lead, and to hold accountable others who purport to act in their interests. So I can't express really how happy I am today that our two distinguished guests have been willing to come to UCLA to discuss openly, forthrightly, and to discuss with you the perils and promise of some really exciting developments in media in the Middle East. And to do so from starting places that seem about as far apart as imaginable, I think. Al Jazeera and a radio network sponsored by the US government. That's true. I said seem as far apart. I don't know whether Norm was uncomfortable being on the far left there, but he seemed to want to move to the center. Okay. So maybe they were further apart. They seemed further apart. Now they're already closer together. But I'm sure we'll learn this afternoon in the symbolic way that just took place on the stage that, in fact, there are important complementarities between the work that Norm is supporting with Radio Sawa and a future television network and the kind of work that Al Jazeera has been doing for several years, and the commitments that bind, I think, both our guests and the organizations they represent in their efforts to improve the world by empowering people through the flow of information. Since that's what universities are supposed to do, I think it's entirely appropriate that UCLA is the venue for this wonderful event. So that's my introduction. Now I want to introduce both the panelists, and then I'll just cede either at minimum the microphone and at maximum the podium to them in sequence, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A period with all of you. So, introductions. Let me first introduce Omar Al Issawi. This is Mr. Al Azhar's first speaking tour in the US, and we're delighted to have him here today. He was born in Kuwait to Lebanese parents, and he attended college in Iowa and Virginia. He's one of the original creators of Al Jazeera, the satellite news operation serving the Arab world, and he continues to be both a reporter for the network and a producer of television content, including a large documentary series for the network. Mr. Al Azhar worked previously for the BBC and has covered events in places as far-flung as Yemen, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Croatia. He's developed a reputation for hard-hitting, hard-nosed, but dispassionate reporting. And as a result, he's garnered several accolades in mainstream American media, and I'd just like to give you some of them. The first one is that he's become a regular contributor, interviewee, I guess, on the Larry King Live show, an extraordinarily important, I think it's fair to say, disseminator of information in the United States. According to a recent New Yorker profile, Al Azhar has become something of a celebrity, emerging as one of the more eloquent and cool-headed commentators on the Middle East. Newsweek said, he has quickly become a respected source of information for Western reporters and a very popular interviewee. The White House has been watching Al Issawi closely. I'll leave it to him to tell us exactly what that means and how he feels about it, but I'm sure there is a way to deconstruct that sentence. The White House has been watching you closely. But welcome and thanks for being here today. Our second guest, to his left, my far left, is Norm Pattiz. Norman J. Pattiz is the founder and chairman of Westwood One, which is America's largest radio network company. It owns, manages, or distributes NBC radio networks, CBS radio networks, the Mutual Broadcasting System, CNN Radio, and Fox Radio News. In addition, Norm is a committed supporter of education. Most notably, I think in this venue, we should all recognize that Norm serves as a dedicated and very engaged regent of the University of California. But there are at least two other strings to Norm's bow. First, I think he is, in some informal sense, an honorary member of the Los Angeles Lakers family. And given that it's a family that seems to be having some internal squabbles at the moment, I'm thinking that being a member of the family is both an honor but brings with it some considerable responsibilities. But in addition to that, Norm has come to play in the last few years an extraordinarily central role, pro bono role, working with and for the American government in the area of international media. In May 2000, Mr. Pattiz was appointed by President Clinton to the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors, and he was then reappointed by President Bush in September 2002. The BBG oversees all US non-military international broadcasting, including Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, WorldNet Television, Radio and TV Marti, and Radio Free Asia. The services reporting to the US BBG provide programming in over 60 languages to over 100 million people outside the United States. Within the BBG, Norm serves on its executive committee, he's chairman of the Middle East Committee, and he's co-chair of the Language Review Committee. Most importantly for today, I think, he spearheaded the creation of the BBG's new Middle East radio network, Radio Sawa, and he's currently leading the development of a new US-sponsored Arabic language satellite television channel that would be distributed throughout the entire Middle East. So I think it's fair to say that we have two of the best informed and most knowledgeable commentators on new media in the new Middle East that one could find. They're not only commentators, they're doers. So I will leave the stage to them so they can do it. Our first speaker will be Mr. Al Azhar.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. I think when talking about the new media in the Middle East, it's important to set the stage for that. The situation was when I was growing up in Kuwait, but in Kuwait it was no different than in any other Arab country, there was the nightly news bulletin, and that was started with whatever the emir, the president, the king, whoever, whatever the activities were that day. And then it progressed to crown prince or vice president, and then you had the interior minister, foreign minister, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes the news bulletins would go on for an hour of absolute nothing. And at the same time, we were expected to believe what was said to us in those news bulletins. We didn't have a choice. The only choice came from abroad, from the BBC. The BBC had the Arabic World Service Radio. The BBC was smart enough to realize in the 1930s, in the run-up to World War II, the importance of launching an Arabic service radio, and so they launched the Arabic radio in order to combat Nazi incursions into the Arab world. And it was again left to the BBC to start the first independent broadcaster in Arabic, television-wise, back in 1994, and I was part of that group. The agreement between the BBC and the Saudi satellite provider called Orbit was that Orbit would finance it while the BBC would maintain editorial independence and integrity. And so it went until one day the government of the United Kingdom was trying to deport a Saudi dissident living in London, Mohammed Al-Mas'ari. I was instructed to go and interview the man. The instructions from our chief editor, a British national, were, you don't let him launch a diatribe against the Saudi government. You hear what he has to say about his case, because we can't go on air with unsubstantiated allegations. See, that's one important thing I learned at the BBC, is that there was a style and libel guide too. So I interviewed the man, limited his answers to the topic, but the end result was that Orbit broke the contract with the BBC, and we ended up on the streets, because that was not what was required in Saudi Arabia, to beam dissidents back to them. During this period, when this was going on, the Emir of Qatar issued a decree launching the Qatari news network, later to be called Al Jazeera, while we were still working for the BBC in that last year in 1996. The Qataris made good use of our misfortunes as employees of the BBC, and they offered us jobs. They promised that it would be exactly like the BBC. And so we went, we believed them, we took them at their word, and we went there. I'll get more into Al Jazeera in a while, but you might find some other details about Arab media interesting. The press was also shackled, except in Lebanon, there was a relative degree of freedom, and the Kuwaiti press was quite vocal at times. I mean, they would often, in collusion with the Kuwaiti parliament, force the government to resign, which was why parliament was dissolved. But that was about it. And even then, there were limitations. There was a publisher of a Lebanese magazine called Al-Hawadith. His name was Salim Al-Lawzi. When the war in Lebanon broke out, he felt he could no longer report from there. So he went to Paris. In 1981, he had to return to Lebanon on a family emergency. On his way back to the airport to head to France, his car was stopped. His wife and driver were let go. Salim Al-Lawzi disappeared for about 10 days to 2 weeks, and only to reappear as a body amidst some bushes. His writing hand had been almost skinned to the bone, either by the use of acid or sharp instruments. And his body had been pierced in several places before being finished with a shot to the head. Other journalists also paid for their lives in Lebanon. Other journalists from throughout the Arab world are today in prisons because torture has become an art form. Torture is not only the preserve of the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein. It happens in all Arab governments, and journalists know that. And that's why we have very special welcoming ceremonies in whichever Arab airports we arrive at. They always take very good care of us, make sure that we know that we are not welcome, but we go. There is baggage that comes with this because you realize that when you go back to your home country, unlike Western journalists, Arab journalists don't have governments to back them up. If one of us disappears, it's usually the work of our government. So nobody is going to try to find us or help us out. I have had colleagues at Al Jazeera who've gone back to their countries on summer vacation, and they were invited for coffee or tea at the intelligence headquarters, and they were asked questions about what goes on at Al Jazeera, people, personalities, to build up the files, because we have files everywhere. In terms of press freedom, most Arab countries are classified as either having noticeable problems or very serious problems. Al Jazeera is a breakthrough in the Arab world. It's the first independent Arab broadcaster to broadcast from within the Arab world. That was very, very important. We are the first broadcaster to have the name of Israel on our maps. We get many complaints from viewers asking us to remove the name Israel from our maps. But you see, we're not in this business to pull the wool over our people's eyes, as governments have done for so long. Because it's these same governments who claim that when they are talking about political negotiations, they want UN Security Council Resolution 242 to be the basis of that, which recognizes the right of the State of Israel to exist. But they will not come out and tell their peoples that. We do that, and that's why we also broke the mold and began hosting Israeli politicians, journalists, commentators, which is why we interviewed former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, and which is why former Minister Natan Sharansky was physically within our studios at Al Jazeera. Now, we are accused of being agents for normalization with the state of Israel. And to us, we will take those accusations, no problem, but we believe that we are in the business of dealing with facts and reality, the dissemination of information, not hiding things. Unfortunately, Al Jazeera is best known for broadcasting Osama bin Laden's messages. And that is widely reported in the Western media. However, the Western media neglects to report that after such a message is broadcast, what we do is we have analysts and commentators come in and analyze, criticize, critique what has just been delivered on the air. Because it's important for our viewers to learn what the other side of bin Laden's argument is. Now, thankfully, after all of these messages, either by bin Laden or his lieutenant, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the last one of which by Zawahiri was a call on Arabs and Muslims to hunt down Westerners wherever they may be, even at shopping centers, and to kill them in ones, twos, or threes. Nobody has taken them up on their word, because our viewers are more sophisticated and more intelligent and smarter than that. But we don't believe in a blackout on bin Laden, because we know that if we don't broadcast that, somebody else will. Because bin Laden is news, and people want to know. But we have criteria, which is why we have an interview with bin Laden that has not been broadcast and will not be broadcast, because it was conducted by one of our staff, and we deemed his questioning of bin Laden not challenging enough. This was not a case of a tape being delivered to us. It was one of ours going to him. And this isn't recent, by the way. Don't think that we know something that the rest of the world doesn't know. We were criticized for broadcasting the images of the American KIAs and POWs during the Iraq War. I was reporting from the Central Command base, excuse me, that night. It was nighttime at Camp Saylia in Qatar. And I was surprised to see them on air. Nobody called up from our headquarters and said, these pictures are coming. And there they were. What I remember is all of the world media was represented in that media center, and everybody rushed into our tiny office, that tiny space. American networks, British, European, but it was mainly the Americans who were most interested. You know what their journalists did? They got paper and pen out and they started writing down how many bodies, how many POWs, their names, their hometowns. Which is, nobody raised any ethical or moral issues about whether we should have broadcast these pictures. That was their immediate reaction, which was like ours. This is news. We were accused of violating the Geneva Convention. Broadcasters don't violate the Geneva Convention. Countries do. The graphic images, we weren't the first to broadcast such graphic images. When the Vietnamese police chief, General Nguyen Loc Loan, executed the Viet Cong captain in the middle of the street, those pictures went out to 20 million American viewers in 1968. The little girl running down the street with her skin peeling off as a result of the napalm bombing. It wasn't Al Jazeera that broadcast those pictures. We are not breaking any international protocol here. And at the same time, we broadcast lots of documentaries, historical documentaries. When masses of humanity were treated like trash in the Nazi concentration camps, we broadcast these pictures in documentaries for our people to see, because that's the part of the world that we come from, that we live in. It's unfortunate, but it's a very, very violent part of the world. The Americans remember that 243 Marines paid for their lives at the Marines barracks bombing in Beirut 20 years ago. 150,000 people were killed in the Lebanese war. When a car bomb goes off, we know what it means. When a bomb goes off in a movie theater, with people sitting around, we know what it means. And that is why we broadcast these pictures. Now, we're not infallible, we make mistakes, yes. But there is no malicious intent on our part. We are only 7 years old. The BBC is 80. And look at how the BBC messed up in the weapons of mass destruction reporting. We come armed with the 5 W's of journalism and with an honest desire to maintain objectivity and professionalism. And we try as hard as we can, but it's really very, very difficult. It's not just that the Americans criticize Al Jazeera. Arab governments have sent delegations to Qatar, to the Emir, complaining about us, which just makes us want to work even harder. We have a program that is dedicated to women. It's called For Women Only. Female moderator anchor. Guests are women, and they discuss women's issues. Issues like, should the woman be the sole breadwinner or the main breadwinner in a house? Actually, that is a very, very simple question to answer. Because the Prophet Muhammad's first wife was his boss. She was his employer. He used to work for her. But unfortunately, we are bogged down today in the Arab and Islamic world in arguments over things that really and truly hinder development, which is why we try to do something different to what's been done. We have talk shows that bring people from the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they go at it. And it's up to the viewer to judge. We have had people, Arabs, calling for American intervention and occupation of Arab countries because they think that Arab countries can change to the better that way. Arabs are saying that, and have said that. There were people who came out in defense of the US invasion of Iraq, just as people who opposed it on our screens. But it's important, this is the effect of Al Jazeera. It breaks this psychological barrier to always have to look over your shoulder because somebody might hear what you're saying and you'll get a knock in the middle of the night at your door and you might disappear for God knows how long. We have been accused of being agents of bin Laden and Saddam and the CIA and the Israeli Mossad and the Wahhabis. And we don't, certainly as employees, we don't make enough money, you know, to be agents of anybody. I mean, that's why it's very important to have more efforts in our business, to have competition. Other broadcasters are starting up now. I think Norm will tell you about Radio Sawa and what they do, but they also have a message. What they do is also very important because it gives a voice to the people, a voice that hasn't been heard for decades. And that is what we also try to do, because ultimately it should be a message of enlightenment, not hatred. Unfortunately, news is bad. It's not something that we control. We don't control the making of it. We are just in the process of reporting it. And in that very, very difficult part of the world where we have no friends, it gives us a greater incentive to work because we know the risks of either losing your job or being imprisoned. It doesn't matter because there are people who are dedicated. Because we know that an incident that takes place in one part of the world is no longer restricted due to boundaries and borders, that the repercussions will be felt everywhere else. And that's why there is a very important need for communication. There is a program that goes out of Baghdad weekly, live, on Al Jazeera, where Iraqis are encouraged to come out and talk about the developments in their country. Not just about attacks and bombings and killings, no. They can go and discuss the things that are happening in Iraq. It's a live program. There's a live program that goes out from Washington, weekly, in which Americans have a platform. And when our reporters were in Iraq during the war, yes, they reflected the Iraqi viewpoint, just like I reflected the American viewpoint from the Central Command base. That's what we were there to do. I thank you for listening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to see Omar, who I met 2.5 years ago when we were in Qatar, talking with the Sheikh Hamad bin Omar Al Thani, and also with the foreign minister and many others in the government about the idea of putting on an American Arabic language broadcasting service that people will listen to. The state of the art for us in the Middle East it was that the entire commitment to broadcasting in Arabic to the Middle East until the advent of Radio Sawa, was 7 hours a day of Arabic language programming produced by the Arabic service of the Voice of America, distributed over shortwave that nobody listened to, and out of a very, very weak medium wave signal out of the island of Rhodes, which was only audible at night and then only in most of the coastal areas of the Levant. When I was appointed to the broadcasting board by President Clinton, I was in fact the only broadcaster who was on that board. The board was created in 1998 when the USIA, which used to oversee international broadcasting, was moved into the State Department. Congress created the Broadcasting Board of Governors, on which I serve, to oversee the broadcasting end of what was USIA, because they felt that broadcasting had a separate and distinct public diplomacy mission as opposed to what was going into the State Department. So they created the board, and the board is composed of 9 members, 8 private citizens, all presidentially appointed and confirmed by the Senate. But private citizens, this is a part-time job. You know, I have a full-time job, even though, frankly, my shareholders have been very, very helpful to me by not screaming and yelling about the fact that this part-time job has turned pretty much into a full-time job. But it's such an incredibly important job, and it's one that is so exciting and so vital and so interesting that it's just something that I could not say no to. The Secretary of State also serves as an ex officio member on the board and is generally represented by the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. But one of the main reasons that the Broadcasting Board of Governors was created is that Congress, in its wisdom, wanted us to act as a firewall between the independence of our journalists and the pressures that might be put on us by the State Department or the administration or Congress or whatever. Because the reality is, with international broadcasting around the world, and certainly being a U.S.-sponsored broadcasting organization, the first thing that we have to get around is the fact that a lot of people just think of us as the mouthpiece for the United States government, when in fact our mission is a journalistic mission. Our mission, simply stated, is to promote and sustain freedom and democracy through the free flow of accurate, reliable, and credible news and information about America and the world to audiences overseas. In so many words, we're to be an example of a free press in the American tradition in many places around the world where there is no such thing. You know, one of the things, you know, when the history of media is written, there will be a large place in it for Al Jazeera, because it was the first Middle Eastern broadcaster who broke the cardinal rule that one Arab country doesn't criticize another Arab country. Al Jazeera criticizes everybody. Everybody, which is the reason why many times, you know, you'll read, or those of us in the trade will find out, that a bureau's been closed down, or a correspondent has been asked to leave the country, because, you know, government sponsorship of radio can work, but it can only work if the journalistic organization is allowed to have the integrity and the credibility to be able to be believable. And once you don't have that, you don't have any credibility, and you don't attract an audience. There's a case in point right now. The U.S. efforts in broadcasting in Iraq, the television and radio efforts in Iraq, are being overseen by the Defense Department. It's by the Pentagon. It's not an operation that's been given to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, even though I think that's about to change. But it's been a miserable failure. And it's been a miserable failure because even with the best of intentions, you know, going into Iraq and trying to create a public radio type scenario, using the journalists from the region, having it run primarily by Iraqis, for Iraqis, eventually to be given to Iraqis, it just hasn't worked out, because what's happened is you're going into a country where there has been no press freedom for 30, 40 years. The journalists who were working for the Ministry of Information know how to do the kind of news and informational gathering that they did for the government, and that, of course, was going to cause immediate problems, you know, for the Defense Department people and for the coalition people and for the, you know, for Bremer and his group that oversees all that. So consequently, the kind of programming that was put up was not the kind of programming that was viewed as being either reliable or credible or honest. And that whole operation really just broke down to be perceived as the the voice, really the mouthpiece for the for Bremer and his group of people. But I think they had the best of intentions. But the problem is, when you put broadcasting in places like the Defense Department or the CIA, it not only has a negative effect on your ability to have any credibility. Those are organizations that are not journalistic organizations. They're not broadcast organizations, and their mission is not the same as ours. Their mission is more influencing than reporting the news straight up and letting the listeners decide for themselves, or the viewers decide for themselves. So consequently, I think that it's in the new bill that's that's coming out of the House and Senate, and that will be signed by the President in fairly short order, the $87 billion. I'm told that there's another chunk of funding that's going to go to the Broadcasting Board of Governors for us to do a specific Iraqi stream of television programming, which will be part of our Middle East television network, but with roughly 10 or 12 hours directed strictly to Iraq. And we anticipate getting the Middle East television network up at the end of January, and the Iraqi broadcast stream right after that. Let me sort of tell you where I'm coming from and why being the only broadcaster on the board has made some changes. I'm no longer the only broadcaster on the board. There are now other broadcasters on the board. But at the time that I came on, since I was the only broadcaster, they asked me to be the chairman of the Language Review Subcommittee, which is the committee that's mandated by Congress to annually determine how our resources are divided up among the 60-some-odd languages that we broadcast in all over the world. And, the information age has made it abundantly clear that priorities change all the time. So every year we take a look at the places where we need to put more of our focus. Well, I told you what I discovered when I first came on the board about the abysmal amount of resources and the practically zero impact that VOA Arabic service was having at the time. When I reported that back to the board, as part of my responsibilities in the Language Review Committee, the board said, you're absolutely right. Congratulations, Norm. You're now the chairman of the Middle East Committee. Go fix it. So within 2 weeks, I was on a plane with my wife and a couple of staffers, and we visited many, many, many countries in the region. It was a fact-finding mission to see what was possible and where we could get access to 21st century transmission, not shortwave radio and things of that sort. And in going through the region, we found that there was certainly among the more moderate Arab governments, there was a tremendous opportunity to get the kind of transmission resources that we need. We now have, I think, 16 FM stations throughout the Middle East in places like Amman, which broadcasts to Amman, the West Bank, and Gaza. We have a FM frequency in Ramallah. We're in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Bahrain. We're in Kuwait. We also have a new FM signal in northern Jordan that booms right into Damascus. And several others, North Africa, in Morocco, and of course now we have 3 FM stations that are broadcasting in Iraq, in Baghdad, Basra, and I think Mosul, if I'm not mistaken. But we're a work in progress. Now, what is it that has made Radio Sawa so different from what U.S. international broadcasting has typically been? Well, the main thing is that we use 21st century proven broadcasting techniques to put our radio station on the air, which means that it is heavily researched. Before we ever did anything in the region, we did a lot of research. We employed research companies and companies that one would use in launching a new radio or television station anywhere in the world. And when we got all the research back, we determined that the best opportunity for us to have an impact, a significant impact, not reaching 1 or 2% of the audience, but the ability to reach 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of audiences, and in some places even higher than that. And what we found was that the biggest, in the broadcasting business, which is my livelihood, when we do a survey to determine what we're going to program in a new station or, new TV station or new radio station, we look for the hole in the marketplace, which means where's the opportunity to present something that's not already presented. I mean, in many cases, you just have to go in and be competitive with everybody who's already on in the market. But we go and we look for the opportunity. The opportunity, there was a hole in that marketplace that was big enough to drive a fleet of Mack trucks through. First of all, over 60% of the population in that region is under the age of 30. And they were not being superserved by anybody in international media or the indigenous media. And the indigenous media, especially in radio, not the case in television, where there's a lot of good things happening and there's a rich media environment. You know, Al Jazeera has spawned competitors who are making it a richer media environment. But in radio, everything was pretty dull and pretty drab, and it sounded like government radio. And people were interested in something that didn't sound like government radio, so we gave it to them. Radio Sawa is music-driven. 75% of our programming throughout most of our program hours is music, heavily researched music. We generally play an Arabic pop song followed by a Western pop song, and then we'll have news 5 to 10 minutes in length twice an hour with headlines at the top and the bottom of the hour. And the rap on Al Jazeera, I keep giving you publicity here when I should be plugging my own thing. And the rap on Radio Sawa was, by the traditionalists in international broadcasting was, well, they'll listen to the music, but they won't listen to the news. Because U.S. policies are, the Arab Street hates U.S. policies. The popularity of America is at an all-time low, which in fact it is. And they'll just listen to the music. They won't even care about the news. We didn't think that would be the case because our research showed a lot of things. We did a lot of advanced research, and one thing that was very clear was that the Arab Street does not believe that the news and information that they're getting from most of their media outlets is truthful or reliable or credible. I mean, one of the reasons why Al Jazeera was such a fantastic success out of the box was because they were so different than everybody else. They sounded different, they looked different, and they gave the kind of news and information that people were interested in hearing. And they continue to do that. They're very, very good. They're a very, very good judge of who their audience is, and that's critical. We have a new 5-year plan at the Broadcasting Board of Governors. It's called Marrying the Mission to the Market, which means we know what our mission is. I had said what our mission was. In so many words, it's a journalistic mission, but it's to be an example of a free press in the American tradition. But the market, we'd never spent any time looking at the market because basically there weren't any broadcasters on the Broadcasting Board, and there aren't a whole lot of broadcasters at any of the services. They're primarily journalists. Now, journalism is the product. I mean, and to me, there's an awful lot of really great journalism that nobody is getting to hear because not enough time is being spent marketing the product in a way that will appeal to a mass audience. And so what we did is we went out and not only researched our music on a weekly basis in 6 different cities, but we also researched the kinds of features that will resonate with our audience. And when we started going out and saying, what kind of features are you interested in hearing, on a radio station before we ever launched? We got back things that you might be surprised. They were interested in features on marriage, dating, computers, the internet, sports, entertainment, religion, an awful lot of the same kinds of features that any 15 to 25-year-old, which is who we primarily target, would be interested in all over the world. So what happened when we launched Radio Sawa? Well, from the very beginning, it sounded so different, and it was so appealing, because it really sounds like a Western, contemporary music station, a pop station. And it was really, it clearly attracted an audience. Some of our detractors would say, well, we're not in the business, we shouldn't be playing Western music, we should be giving them the information. Well, the fact of the matter is, they don't like most of the information that they get about the United States, because most of the information that comes about the United States comes from the indigenous media. And most of the broadcasters in the indigenous media, you can imagine that there is a good deal of anti-American sentiment, not just because of our policies, which are completely unpopular in the region, but because many of the broadcasters know who their constituencies are and they broadcast to appeal to their own constituencies. But back when I made my first trip to the region, I mean, it was not unusual to hear hate speak on radio and television, incitement to violence, disinformation, government censorship, and journalistic self-censorship. And it was from within that kind of environment that the Arab Street was getting its impressions not only of U.S. policy, but of our people, of our culture, of our society. So we really felt that at the very least the United States needed a horse in this race. So what were we going to do? Go out and lead with policy? Well, that wasn't going to attract an audience. People thought that they knew what the American policy was, and of course we continue to report on American policy. So instead of doing that, we went out and we used music as a tool to attract a younger audience, and it has worked phenomenally well. We've been doing research on a weekly basis since we first went on the air. But, you know, so some of the information that I'm going to pass on to you now was not surprising to us when we contracted with A.C. Nielsen to do an independent study of how Radio Sawa, you know, was doing and how it is doing today. And this is a study that was just completed just a few weeks ago. And we surveyed Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait, because those are the places that we'd been broadcasting to the longest. It's really quite spectacular. When you take a look at those countries that I just mentioned, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, UAE, and Kuwait, we reach an average of 32% of the 15-plus audience in those countries. What's really amazing about those kinds of audience shares is that in many of those countries, like Egypt, you know, we're on from an AM, we've got a powerful AM signal, but we don't broadcast from inside Egypt. So that signal is only audible from dusk till dawn in most places, and not audible at all in other places. And in Jordan, for instance, where we have a 30 share of 15-plus listeners, that's only half the country, because we're only heard on FM stations that reach half the population. So when you go in and you take a look at a place like Amman, for instance, we're being listened to. As a matter of fact, the first research we did on Amman, we asked the question, what's your favorite radio station? This was within 30 days of going on the air. 50% of those responding said Radio Sawa. Have you listened to Radio Sawa in the last 24 hours? 90% of the audience said that they had listened to Sawa within the last 24 hours. Then we ask a question, what radio station do you listen to most for news? And when we said that 30 days after we were on the air, 1% of our audience said Radio Sawa. When we asked those same questions 6 months later, 50% still was their favorite radio station. Over 90% of the people still listen to it on a regular basis. But 41% said Radio Sawa was the station that they listened to most for news. So what does it mean? It means that you have to develop credibility by walking the walk. You know, when we asked the question going in, would you listen to a radio station that was brought to you by the American government? 60% said yes, which meant 40% said no. Now, you know, and but a 60% number to somebody who's in the radio business, I mean, that's like a giant number. I mean, these kinds of shares of audience are incredible. They're the kinds of shares of audience that one might have remembered seeing in television 25 years ago when there were only 3 networks here in the United States. But when you continuing with the Nielsen numbers, when you take a look at just our target audience, the 15 to 30-year-old audience, over 42% of the 15 to 29-year-old audience say they listen regularly to Radio Sawa. And what about a couple of other things? How do our listeners now feel, not just in Amman, Jordan, but all over the country, I mean all over the region, about the reliability and credibility of our news? When you ask the question about reliability and truthfulness, we find that an average of 75% of our listeners consider our news reliable and credible, which keeps us right up at the very top with local indigenous, you know, frankly, it puts us way ahead of most of the indigenous media, and it's similar to what they feel in terms of reliability and credibility about the BBC. But remember, we have a much larger audience than the BBC. And then, you know, a lot of the questions we get asked when we talk about Sawa in Congress and at the State Department and so forth, as you know, this is all very well and good, but are you changing any attitudes? First of all, let me say, it's not our job to change attitudes. It's our job to report the news. Now, historically, in the history of this country, when you've taken the news and you've done it in such a way that it is an example of a free press, those kinds of things tend to make feel better about democracy and freedom, because when they get the information, that they have to to listen to, and it's reliable information. Of course, the people who bring you that information tend to get a great deal of credibility as well. But when we ask the question, when A.C. Nielsen asked the question about how favorably or unfavorably inclined are you towards the United States, by a 3-2 margin, SAWA listeners had a much more positive attitude about the United States than did did non-SAWA listeners or listeners from the general population. So it's very, very clear that we are having some kind of an effect, and that the effect is going to be positive. But by the same token, we haven't gotten into this thing overnight, and it's going to take a lot of time to turn things around if they can be turned around. Because the fact of the matter is the Broadcasting Board of Governors does not make policy. There's a lot of people who think we should make policy over the air. We don't make policy, and we don't do propaganda. There are other agencies within the government that do that, but we don't. We in fact have to compete for funding and compete for audience with other agencies within the United States government, including the agency that's currently broadcasting in Iraq, who a lot of people listen to and think of as propaganda. And, they're probably right. But that's not what we do, because we know that if we don't have credibility, we won't have listeners. We have a saying on Radio SAWA. Incidentally, SAWA is the Arabic word for together. We have a saying on Radio SAWA, which is, you listen to us, and we will listen to you. And when you listen to the features on Radio SAWA, you hear a lot of our listeners asking questions that are answered by our listeners. We have call-in lines, we have interactive programs, because it's very, very important to connect to your audience. Radio is a very personal medium. I dare say that radio helps define who you are. If I stepped into any of your automobiles today and took a look at the settings on your car radio, I'd know something about who you are and what your tastes are. It's like walking into somebody's house and seeing the magazines that are laid out on a coffee table. If there's a magazine there about tennis, it's probably pretty good idea that maybe there's somebody in that household who likes tennis. You can do the same thing with radio. Let me say a couple of quick things about our new television project before we turn this over to the really interesting part. Because of the success of SAWA, we were able to get the budget to do a new 24-hour, 7-day-a-week Arabic language satellite television station to be broadcast and compete with the other indigenous media, with the indigenous media, with the Al Jazeeras, with the Al Arabiyas, with the NBCs, and what have you. Because we think it's very, very important for there to be a pipeline of information that comes to you that is, distinctly American from its point of view, because we're all human beings. People who cover the news, if you go out right now and there's a big story going on and you send somebody out from CNBC, Fox News, ABC, CBS, or MSNBC, they're all covering the same story. It's all, they're all examples of a free press, but the ultimate story may wind up, looking 3, 4, 5 different ways, because we're all human beings, we all interpret the news, but we have to do it according to, journalistic principles that will stand the test and will allow people to, to think of us as a credible source of news and information, as well as a good place to go if you want to, if you want other type of programming as well. So we expect to be launching the new Middle East Television Network. It won't be called the Middle East Television Network. It'll be called something else, which we're in the final processes of doing our final research on, and doing the on. It'll have a wonderful on-the-air look. It'll be news and information driven, which means that 14 or 15 hours a day of the programming will be news and information that we generate from our own news staff. We have a very large news staff in the Middle East with a Middle East broadcast center in Dubai and bureaus in Baghdad and in Amman and in Cairo and in other places. So we think we're going to put out a very good, solid, quality product. But ultimately you leave it up to your viewers to decide how good your product is, because they can vote with their feet. If they don't like what you're saying, they can turn you off and go someplace else. But, again, it's not our business to tell them what they want to hear. When the Voice of America was first started 60 years ago, whoever it was who signed on said, "This is the Voice of America. The news that you hear may be bad, and the news that you hear may be good, but it will always be truthful." And so long as we can maintain that caliber of credibility, then we have a real service to be able to put forward in what is increasingly becoming, an environment where hearts and minds, at least to my way of thinking, hearts and minds are far more important than the kinds of wars that you fight with bombs and bullets. And in the information age, there's a tremendous opportunity in the information age to interact with your audience, to know your audience, and to present your country in a way that you think is in keeping with the best traditions of American freedom and democracy. So anyway, I will call end my remarks right now and look forward to answering any of your questions, as I'm sure Omar will as well. Thank you.